Welcome to Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living. Join me, Chris.
And me, Jacqueline, for real conversations about life, death, and everything in between.
Learn to connect with your intrinsic power to grow and heal, how to laugh at your own humanness and not take life too seriously.
Through healthy conversations between the feminine and masculine, you learn how to harness the power of relationship and the mirror to befriend your shadow and to trust that any obstacle that gets in your way is there to help you grow.
Together, working at a practical level, you'll learn to trust that everything that is happening is for you, your growth, and ultimate freedom.
Our circumstances don't matter. It's only how we relate to them that does.
Get ready to befriend the wisdom of your body and the power of your mind.
Break Free and Trust starts now.
Welcome to Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living. I'm Chris.
And I'm Jacqueline.
In today's show, we're going to explore the role that fear plays in our lives and what choices we have in the face of fear. We're also going to share our own experience of fear, both in the past and in the current moment. And we're also going to discuss how facing and overcoming those fears have led to growth opportunities and ultimately more happiness in our lives. And hopefully that can translate into your lives. So Jacqueline, boy, man, life gets interesting when you really pay attention to it and just sit back and watch how it unfolds and even ask yourself, what's trying to happen here? So 2 weeks ago, we taught a yoga class together, and the topic was fear. And I actually think I remember in last week's podcast, we brought up fear and said, you know what, we got to come back to this one in a future podcast. And fear has certainly made itself very known in our household in the last week or so, and is clearly asking to be explored. I think it's even had an impact on where you are today. So with that, Jacqueline, why don't you tell our listeners, where the heck are you and why are you not sitting here beside me today?
Okay, thanks, hon. I am currently at an Airbnb in Calgary. I'm at an Airbnb in Calgary because over the last few weeks, there's been huge changes in our household. And those changes shook the very foundation of me, I'll say, in a pretty profound way. So over the last 3 weeks, all three of my biological kids have left the house. And from the ages of 13 to 18, each one of them set off to school to experience something that they each really wanted to experience. And for about 2 days, all was pretty peaceful and well. And then the phone calls started. From my daughter, who's the middle one, who came to Calgary to explore a prep school for basketball. And those phone calls began with, regular homesickness, which was to be expected. But as the phone calls continued and sort of began to bookend our days from morning to night, what I started to experience on the other end of the phone was witnessing my daughter get trapped in a really profound amount of fear. So much so that I really watched the fear response in her body take over, and her mind became really narrow in its focus. And my experience was of watching my adventurous, excited, motivated kid become like an animal that was trapped in a box who was trying desperately to find her way out. And as we rode through that together, what happened for me was something that was unprecedented. And that is that her fear triggered a fear inside of me that it was so out of whack with what was showing up, that it shook me to my core and helped me to realize that some of my own core wounding was actually waking up, and something that had been latent, if not hidden, was beginning to show itself.
Yeah, and I was with you during this, and I can witness that fear that was showing up for you was very real. So real, in fact, that I think it was just even a few nights ago now. You got up in the middle of the night and you were physically sick, and I had to hold you in my arms for well over 2 hours while you just shook like a little girl. You said something, and you said something really critically important there, and that night too. Actually, I think you almost used the same words. That this fear has awoken something up in me, something latent. This fear was lurking in you, and there's now this external trigger has awoken and arisen this fear. And I want to take a moment here, just to talk about fear in general. So fear is absolutely necessary for us. It's necessary for survival. In fact, we can go as far as say fear is beautiful. And what I mean by that is there's a tiger in the room, we come in, what happens? Our body goes into fight or flight, adrenaline gets pumped into our system. Our range of focus now narrows down to the task at hand and what has to happen, shutting everything else out. And all the systems in our body, all our energy gets marshaled to go after that task. So it's increasingly very important for our survival. It gets us out of the room with the tiger. It helps us in those driving situations, maybe some type of a conflict's happening, you name it. Anytime where this real, present, and immediate danger is facing us, fear kicks in to help us survive that. And if we didn't have that, we didn't have fear telling us what to do or giving us extra energy, we don't survive as a species. There's another type of fear, though. And this is the fear of things that can potentially happen in the future. We'll call it psychological fear. There's no immediate present danger. It's something that might happen. It's, oh my God, I'm going to get fired at work, or my partner's going to leave me, or something's going to happen to my kids. And this is a big one with most parent listeners. I'm worried about something happening to my kids. And the way that fear manifests itself in the body, the psychological fear, is very similar to the way real fear manifests. We're going to go into fight or flight to some degree. Adrenaline's pumping the body. Cortisol is going to increase, and our range of focus is going to narrow. So we're looking for a way to resolve that fear and cut ourselves off to other opportunities. Now, the big problem with this is that one of those fears is short-lived and goes away because there's a clear present danger that we get past. The other fear just keeps going. It doesn't go away. It keeps going and going and going and gets compounded. So on one hand, fear is this life-saving thing we need for our survival. And on the other hand, it creates a mental prison for us. And it's a prison that's made with walls of fear and bars made of fear. And I think that's what we're going to explore a little bit more right now.
So can I jump in for just a sec?
Please.
I think that one of the things that's really important for us also to understand is what happens in our bodies through this fear response that you've just described. And I love the way that Peter Levine describes it, and I will never speak it as well as he does, but I'll give you an example of that for myself. Well, I'll speak it in my own words anyways, is that, you know, in the animal kingdom, when an animal is being chased, the fear response initiates, which gives the animal the capacity to escape, like you just spoke, or to play dead. And what happens after that animal escapes, or the fear response that's needed is now over, the danger is over, is that the animal runs to the center of its herd and very naturally begins to shake. And it shakes off all of the chemicals that had been initiated for it to be able to run or play dead or whatever. What's different for us, and then the fear response is over, just like you were just talking about. What happens for us as humans is that we're often told, shh, it's okay, it's okay. And what happens in our systems is that rather than being able to shake off that fear, what we're left with is a holding on to it, and the chemicals of fear get trapped inside of our bodies in such a way that we actually are not, we're not given the opportunity to release it. And so it stays, not just emotionally. We're not just emotionally trapped in the prison and the bars that you've spoken of, but we're physically trapped in the bars of the emotion. And one of the things that I've experienced through my work in somatic experiencing is that even 10 years later, given giving the body the opportunity to quiet enough to experience that fear, the body will naturally begin to shake and release what's been long held. I just wanted to jump in and share that because I think it's really important in terms of information.
Yeah, it is. And what it's brought me back to that example of the antelope going to the herd and shaking is it's a little bit about what's a lot like what I experienced with you the other night, where you had this fear and you just shook. You shook and shook and shook. And we're going to get into this later in the show, but after that shaking the next day, it's potentially a different response you had to what was going on in the environment, in the sense that you'd work through the fear that you'd been feeling in some sort of profound way by shaking it off and just experiencing it.
Yeah, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And that speaks really beautifully to the power of a container. And for me, that container was you. So with that, how about we shift and take a little break, and then we'll come back and have a deeper conversation.
And we're back. And I'm just going to go back to where we finished that conversation. I think, it really feels like the conversation is breaking wide open with a couple things. One, this reference to a mental prison with bars made of fear, but also this idea of shaking that relates to what happened in your own experience, Jacqueline. You mentioned being really shaken by something that awoken inside you. And I was wondering, Jacqueline, are you ready to get really vulnerable with the audience regarding what that is?
You mean the idea of shaking for 2 hours in your arms wasn't vulnerable enough? Yeah, it would be a pleasure, because I think that, in a lot of ways, I think I just experienced a lot of what I work with people on experiencing, but had never fully given myself permission to experience myself. So yes, absolutely. Just gonna take a moment here.
Maybe what I'll ask is you take that moment, just, getting at what that core wound you're talking about was, if that's possible in this.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So as we go through life, we have experiences in life, especially when we're young, that we're not able to digest, that we can't completely take in, that shake our system so much that rather than be able to integrate and experience, we mask, we find coping mechanisms to armor ourselves from being able to have to feel. And my experience over time, and I can speak to that as we move, is that I actually developed an entire persona to protect me from feeling the very thing that I came to feel the other night. And the persona was one that looked really good. It was one that I got a lot of praise for in a lot of ways. The persona was one of being really capable, having my shit together, being able to almost be a superhero through things that would have made most people fall apart. And what I've come to realize actually is that all of those behaviors were simply ways of me avoiding having to be with a really deep level of fear that almost doesn't even have words. And when I was with it, and you said I was almost like a little girl in your arms, I would say I was almost more like a baby in your arms. And I have to say, I'm so grateful for your arms, because I'm not sure that I would have been able to be with that level of fear without them. When I was about 18 months old, my mom, who had basically spent her entire life wanting to be a mother, who loved me with everything that she had, found out that well, she was pregnant, and she found out that my sister was really struggling to survive in her belly. And she had to go and be on hospital bed rest. And she was afraid that seeing her in the hospital would be damaging for me. And so she left, and I didn't see her for months. My experience was one of intense fear. And I have it's so alive in my nervous system that I can almost, I can almost experience that feeling of like, oh my God, where is she? Where's my person? Where's my survival? And when she came back, I learned that words that came out of my mouth were no more bottle, no more diaper, no more baby, which essentially means that I had weaned myself off of a bottle. I was toilet trained, and I was sleeping in a big girl bed. All to say, I had developed all of these ways of taking care of myself so that nobody had to worry about me, and maybe nobody would leave me again.
Mm.
And when I learned that as a mom, my heart kind of broke. And I imagine my mother's heart must have broken at that time as well. And it's funny when I stop and I think about when I got married to my ex-husband, one of the things that was in the speech that my father made about me was just how capable I was and how proud he was of me for that. So that really speaks to, it was my dad that I was left with, it speaks to that piece. Now, there's another piece of my story, which is that when I was younger, my mom also got very sick, and she was diagnosed with cancer when I was 13. And that same behavior that I had established as a kid, or as a little kid, woke back up again, which was, my mom is sick, our family unit is completely shaken, everybody's feeling their feelings, but I have no memory of being afraid that my mom was going to die. The memory that I have is of, I remember a feeling of dread. Actually, I can physically remember fear showing up as a feeling, but my response to it was to get busy, making sure that my sisters and my dad and my mom were okay. I became a harmony keeper and a caretaker, and I kept myself busy. In other words, I kept myself from avoiding having to experience the fear. And as I sit here now, what I'm really aware of, having been through this experience with you and sort of on my own in terms of feeling into my own experience, is that the fear was that I will shatter into a million pieces if my environment or the people in it are not okay. And what I've come to really understand over the last few days, and it just gave me shivers, is that my experience being with you on Bowen Island, getting phone calls from my daughter who felt like she was really decompensating, was that that same fear was initiated. That if my little girl is not okay, I'm going to shatter. And that's, yeah, that's, wow, that's as vulnerable, I think, as I can possibly get right now.
And you know, as you spoke, I watched you go drop deeper and deeper into yourself. And as you said, you started feeling shivers. And I could, I know you well, and I felt the intensity there. And I hope our listeners did too. There's a deep ingrained belief that's surfacing and being challenged and being looked at right now. There's a couple of things I really heard in there, though, Jacqueline. This idea of numbing your feelings of fear through looking after others, fixing, doing, accomplishing, being this rock star, was a way to numb those fears. And the other thing was the problem that then creates in that you're receiving accolades from the world for being this type of person. You're getting validated, you're getting title, you're getting honored by your father at a wedding speech for this. And in reality, what you've been doing is running an early childhood survival program.
Absolutely.
And the more you kept moving forward, the more you identified with what was in fact a survival program, and it really begins to crystallize. And just as a side note, you're not alone in that. Honestly, I work with lots of leaders in business that are up in the C-suites that got there by running a childhood survival program, is what they've been doing. And so when they get there, they're not happy. They don't feel accomplished because they're baffled at why they're feeling the way they're feeling.
Yeah. And I think that's an amazing point, because there's something that happens that our patterning works until it doesn't. And, I think in many ways, midlife is a time where that really starts to stop working, because there's something that happens in us where it's like, I remember a mentor of mine used to speak about this all the time. His name's Michael Talbot Kelly, and he would speak about this idea that our soul will not rest until our destiny is given the freedom to make itself manifest. And the only way for that to happen is that whatever is in the way needs to be cleared. And most often, what's in the way are these patterns of behavior that actually get in the way of us fulfilling our destiny. And so the very things that we love the most about ourselves actually end up being the very things that get in the way of us being ourselves. And for some of us, that happens really organically. It happens slowly. It happens over time. And that's my experience. But then for some of us, the voice of that soul will speak. I'll call it the soul. You can call it whatever you want. It's like a knock on the door. And first it starts as a whisper. And then the knock gets louder. And then the knock gets so loud that actually the entire house is shaken. And when that house gets shaken, we're left with no possibility except to face what it is that we have to face. And my love, that kind of experience is what you've experienced. And I now would like to ask you if you would be willing to get really vulnerable and share what happened when the house of cards fell apart.
Before I do that, I want to, just something you said there. I just want to clarify, because what really came across to me there is you're almost saying that this idea that we've developed this identity of who it is we think we are. And that's the thing that's actually potentially getting in our way of our destiny and having our happiness, as our attachment to this thing we think is us. And it's not true.
Absolutely.
That's very profound. Yeah. And we live in an identity-based world. And so that sounds like another episode. So, but back to your question, and maybe I'm trying to avoid it, but you know what, I want to collect myself on this one. So I'm going to suggest that we take a quick break here, and when we come back, I'll get into my story.
Sounds like a great idea. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back, everybody. So, hun, now that you've taken a few moments to collect yourself, would you be willing to share your really powerful story with our audience?
Yeah, and part I want to mention when I wanted to collect myself is my story. It's deep, it's complicated, it's got all these facets, and I want to share it from the context of facing my fears. So here I go. So I grew up in an alcoholic home with an alcoholic mother, like I mentioned, many of our listeners can relate to. And she ended up actually taking an early exit in life due to implicit complications through the disease. But this environment of growing up in an alcoholic household imprinted on me fears of abandonment, fears of not being worthy of love, fears of not being valued. And I suppose an underlying limiting belief or belief of just not being enough. And we all need food, shelter, love, a sense of belonging. And so as a child, I had to develop survival strategies to get love and a sense of being important and compete with my mother's addiction at the same time. And in doing so, I thought I needed to be special to move to the top of my mother's priority list. And I was also, I recall being a really emotionally sensitive child. And I recognize now that I had to learn to turn that off, that I couldn't be that person and then survive in that household. And so the combination of these two things manifested for me. I found myself learning to overachieve, and overachieving got me noticed, got me accolades, as you said. And, if I look back at at my trend, my progression, really started in high school where I started, getting top marks in my class and getting those accolades from that. Started getting more involved in sports and competing and getting accolades from that. And it moved on with me in university. Graduated top of my class. I took the hardest programs. I took the hardest classes, no elective, being in the executive council of my fraternity and just pushing hard in all aspects. And it showed up in my work where I'd be constantly trying to outwork people, pass people, outperform people. And it even, man, it showed up in my sports. I couldn't just run a 10K. I couldn't just run a marathon. I'd have to run ultra marathons. And the list goes on. And I know many of you can probably relate to some of this stuff. And my God, it even showed up in my kids' sports. I couldn't just have them participate in sports. I had to coach every team they were ever on, right? That's how this thing manifested itself. And what I was really doing was I was using this to numb my feelings of inferiority and not being enough. And from it, I got accolades. I got material wealth. I got all these trimmings of life that we look at as success. And I also got a false sense of superiority. And if I'm really honest with myself, and that's a lot about what someone in recovery like myself is, I was an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. That was my identity. And it worked until it didn't. At the top of my game, this achievement crutch that I developed really stopped working. And I had no way to deal with fear or deal with these feelings. I've never done it my entire life. And so I turned to alcohol and drugs and other coping mechanisms that are equally as unhealthy. And so I ended up getting on this path of addiction. And this path ends in three places. It ends in jails, it ends in institutions, and it ends in death. And I hit two of them. And at my bottom, and that's the whole bottoming process is another story, but just assume it's an ugly place. At my bottom, I had to choose between being bound by these shackles of fear, which quite honestly probably meant death, or facing my fears and finding my way through them. And by grace, I found the other path.
So, I wasn't with you at the beginning of this process, obviously, but I've watched you through the last number of years through this process. And when you say you hit a bottom, I mean, you lost everything. And I've watched you face losing everything. And I've watched you choose to find a way forward. And I would love it if you would get even a little more vulnerable, if you're willing, and share what that means, both in terms of what you lost and maybe in part how you found your way forward.
I will. And yeah, just as you say that, I can feel my heart pounding, my breath getting, because I'm in this place, right? And it's not an exaggeration when you, or a hyperbole when you say I lost everything, because I lost everything that mattered to me. Let's put it that way. Everything that mattered to me. I lost my family. I lost the vast majority of my friends, my sanity, my career, my freedom. And mostly I lost myself. I became a monster. Like I really became a monster in this period. And I really got to this point where I just said, I can't do this anymore, because everything I was doing was making things worse. And I was hurting all the people I loved. And I just needed to stop. And so I just found this point where I gave up and I surrendered. And this is the part of the story where if you've experienced this, if you experience this place, as soon as I say two words, you can start nodding. And I know what he's talking about. And if you haven't, it's really hard to translate this into words, but I'm going to try. And so what I felt at that moment was almost this warmth and a deep knowing that everything was going to be okay as long as I got out of my own way. I needed to let the old me, which was driven by 1,000 form of fears, needed to let it go. I needed to let it die. And I needed to allow a new version of me to emerge from that letting go and from that old version of me dying. And that's really what I had to do. I had to recognize that this identity that I thought was so me, that had got me all these amazing things that led to all these what I thought were successes in life, did not serve me at all anymore and was going to lead me to my death.
It's amazing. You know, when I listen to you speak, what I'm hearing you speak to is this idea of ego death. And, you know, I think that for people who haven't experienced it, it probably wouldn't make sense. But ego death is as terrifying as physical death itself. And, you know, I through happenstance, I did a lot of work around John Sarno's book and his experience, which I can get into now or at a different time. But what I would say is that what I've learned in working with people, and again, deeply now looking at myself, is that we will do anything to avoid dismantling the ego structures that we have built to protect our psyche. And we'll do it so profoundly that we will make our bodies physically sick before we will even begin to look at what the armor is and what the structures are that we built around ourselves to protect ourselves. And a part of that comes from the fact that when, both in your story and in my story, the timing of so much of when those structures come into place is when we're really young. And when we're really young, we literally feel like without those structures, we're going to die. Because it is actually at that time about survival. When we're young, our survival is dependent on being fed, on being watered, but it's really dependent on being loved, right? And so everything that we do is designed to allow us to feel that that's so. So it's not surprising to me that all of these things happened. It's not surprising to me that you were unconsciously willing to damage yourself more and more physically before you would be willing to actually crack open emotionally and have to look at what those structures actually were.
Yeah. And, one of my spiritual teachers is G.I. Gurdjieff, and he's a 19th century Armenian yogi philosopher, and he talks about what our identities are in the sense of an analogy of building a crystal structure, a structure out of crystal. And as we go through life, that structure just keeps building on top and top on top, and so it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And at some point, if we hit it, we recognize, wait a minute, this identity I have is actually not who I am. It's a collection of things I have used over time, and I need to switch directions. But the process, and this is why the analogy of crystallization, the process of building a new structure involves tearing down the old one. And the longer you've gone, the harder it becomes. And that's where all these coping mechanisms come in to do anything but tear that crystal structure down.
It almost sounds like this crystal structure that we're talking about, or that Gurdjieff refers to, is actually a model for survival. And what we're speaking about is like literally hammering gently into that structure, gently, or like an earthquake happens and just cracks the whole structure down, like completely, in your case, to a model that moves from survival to a model of what it looks like to actually thrive. But to get to that place of thriving, we're having to confront something that sends most of us into addiction or coping mechanisms and different behaviors that help armor us from actually having to feel. Does that sound right to you?
It does, yeah. And it's an we're gonna call it, we're gonna name it. It's an ego death, which is needed to get past those the fears and the limiting beliefs that have created that structure. And having experienced aspects of it, I'm still in the journey. We all are, but experience the big part of the breakdown and the death of that identity. I can tell you, it does feel like death, and I can't imagine, death being much worse than that. On that happy note, why don't we take a break? See you in a bit.
Okay. Welcome back. So just before the break, we were talking a little bit about ego death and the importance of ego death and breaking free. And I'm sort of struck by this idea that, well, that's true. I'm also sort of questioning the importance of the ego at the same time. So I'm going to turn it over to you and see if you have any thoughts on that one.
I do, and I have strong thoughts. So, I see the ego as essentially as a fear-based operating system. And that sounds a bit harsh, but also keep in mind, I said earlier, fear is necessary. Fear is necessary for survival. In fact, it's beautiful. And I can say the same thing about ego. Even though it's a fear-based operating system, it's critical for our survival. And I'm going to put some context on what that means in the human experience, right? Human baby is born. It's a blank slate, connected to source, but completely helpless. Like a horse can get born and get up and walk, a few hours later. Most animals are away from their mothers and fathers quite early on in the digestion period. Humans, what is it? 13 to 20 years, maybe with some kids 35 years, right? And they cannot survive. And they can't, and they need to survive this period. They need to survive the family they're born into, the country they're born into, the culture, the society, the rules. Do they have a brother and sister that bullies them? What's like all of these things, all these facets. Children need to survive, not just from a food and shelter standpoint, but from psychologically. They need to get love, they need to belong, they need to fit in, and they need to be. And so they're going to we develop personalities and personas as a survival tool to make it from a helpless infant to a robust adult that then can go on and be what they're meant to be or choose to be in the world. But at the end of the day, it's a survival mechanism. And the inherent challenges it brings with that is that we have to understand the ego has one prime directive and one only. That is survival. Nothing else. It's not happiness. It's not actualization. It's not these other things. It's survival. And if we really take it down to its limits, the problem that creates is for an operating system like the ego, the best way to survive is if you survive yesterday is to make today it look exactly the same as yesterday because it's a known quantity. So the ego's resistance to change, it's resistant to growth. It's even resistant to you having new ideas or new belief system. It wants to shut you down and box you in because that's how you survived. So again, it's this paradox. We need it to survive to adulthood, but it doesn't serve us past a certain point when we become adults. And aspects of it, many aspects of it need to be dissolved. And that is effectively the message, my belief, of every spiritual system out there is really talking about the ego and this transition. Jesus on the cross is probably the most widely known allegory of this in my mind. It's that is a representation of the ego death. Up on the cross, and there's immense suffering. It's a complete limit story. Everything is destroyed in this process. And then after 3 days, I'm just going to call it an indeterminate amount of time, and maybe it's Moses in the desert for 40 years. Who knows? We get reborn. And that shows up in Sikhism and Hinduism, and I don't know all the systems, but very similar message from a metaphysical standpoint shows up there. And for us in our work, we call it break free and trust or redesign for living. It's the same type of idea we're talking about here.
So I just want to interrupt you for one sec, because what I'm really hearing you say in a lot of ways, if I was to boil it down, is that we really spend the first half of our life driven by this ego structure, building this ego structure. And then we hit a point where we just can't do it anymore. And the second part of our life is about tearing down that structure in order to come home to who we truly are.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the words of Richard Rohr, one of the spiritual teachers, first half of life is building a container, and the second half of life is supposed to be filling it. But so many people just spend the rest of their life as container builders, and that becomes a challenge. But I don't want to forget the story we started with. And so we talked about two paths of facing our fears and dissolving our ego. One was this quick, abrupt way, which I took, and the other is slower. And this is more your story. And so I want you to take us back to your story about your core wounding that was making itself known and why you find yourself in Calgary today.
You forgot all about that. So my experience of really being faced with my own fear and being held by you through that experience, it opened something in me. And what I came to really realize was that when I was 18 months old and feeling the fear that I felt, it was impossible for my mother to hold me. She wasn't present. And my dad, God bless him, as much as he adored me, didn't really know how to be with big emotion. And I think intuitively I knew that. The gift that I have based on the life that I've built is that I do know how to be with really big emotion. And what became very clear to me as you and I were driving in the car was that I needed to go home, pack a bag, and go to my daughter, because her fear had brought her to a place where she was entering the trauma vortex. And that's a dangerous place to be without a container. And I wanted to drive to her to be able to create the very same container, not to be able to rescue her from feeling her fear. Because as we've just talked about, being able to actually feel that is the only way to move through that, but rather to be a container to help titrate her fear so that she could be allowed to feel it. And that rather than making decisions, which would be, I'm going to escape and run home out of fear, I could help her nervous system quiet enough so that she could then make choices from a calm system where her frontal cortex could actually be online and she could be making decisions that were aligned with her dreams and her passions and her ideas rather than just being trapped in fear. And so we actually as a family made a choice to come and be here for 4 months and create a space that would give her permission to do just that. And I have to say that even just in short order, what I've watched is the fear be spoken and shared, and then begin to dissipate in a way that's given her permission to experience where she is and expand her sight so that she can live into a decision about whether or not she chooses to be here.
And from, even what you've shared with us today, that sounds like an incredible breakthrough for you and a big change in patterns of behavior. If maybe we're not, what would have fallen into your own patterns of behavior, old patterns of behavior, maybe led to in the past?
Well, I think if I was to get really honest, I would say even probably just a few years ago, following my own patterns of behavior first would have looked like some things that I'm sure many of you can relate to. It would have looked like overeating. It would have looked like grabbing a glass of wine. It would have looked like going to find a pack of cigarettes. It would have looked like anything I could do to avoid actually having to feel what I was feeling, because it honestly felt horrific. It would have looked like putting on a bunch of armor and not actually feeling. And then it probably would have looked like me flying into Calgary, rescuing my kid, bringing her home, and saving the day, which all would have been out of whack with what was really wanting to happen.
And tomorrow would have looked like yesterday.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, and everyone would feel safe. And that's, beautiful example. And so one question I have for you. So what's happened, or what work have you done that's finally able for you to take on this fear and work through it now? Because you've talked about this fear being, up with you until recently. So what's changed? For me, I mean, I got the easy way out in a sense. I got desperation, but you had to do something to get here. What was it? Maybe it's something that, our audience can benefit from in terms of tools or.
Yeah. I can speak to tools, and I will, and there's a lot of them. But I can't really do that without first saying that it's you in a lot of ways. In working to develop and to grow a really honest and profound relationship with you that's driven not by our egos, but by something so much more honest. And I'll take a risk and say the word divine. I've been able to explore things that without that foundation, I wouldn't have been able to explore. And that's a gift that I never really imagined that I would experience in this lifetime. So some of you may be able to relate to that. Most of you probably won't. I know that I never even imagined what that could look like. But I hope that together over time, through this podcast, we can help model that for you and show you what that can look like. But beyond that, I've spent a lot of time working with many different tools. And I would say that the ones that stand out most, and we can come back to these another time, are Kristen Neff and Michael Germer's work around self-compassion and mindful self-compassion. Michael Brown's work around the presence process and conscious connected breath work, and Kundalini Yoga and its capacity to be able to really help us push through by energetically clearing our channels.
Yeah, and that's beautiful. And we're coming close to the end of our show, but I wanted to, this concept of divine union that you mentioned and we talk about all the time, how it relates to your story. I just want to bring it back to my story and facing fears and ego death and new identity as it relates to you. In that I still remember this. It was about it was our first date, and I had come to this place in my thought process as I tore down my old identity, was building this new one, who I wanted to be and trying to change the way I was, that people just I couldn't relate to people. They couldn't understand me. And I was probably just going to be alone the rest of my life. But I was okay with that because I was really starting to fall in love with the person I was becoming. As I was seeing these defects of character I had and where they came from and whatnot, I was trying to rebuild myself as something I could be proud of. And I remember you were asking me what my story was. And I said, okay, I'm going to give you my story, and it's going to be really honest because I wasn't trying to impress. I just decided I wanted to be honest, and I told you the whole story, all the ugly parts of it. And I remember you just looking at me and just saying how much you appreciated the honesty and being real. And that's, I think, the very first time in all this process that I thought this person actually sees me for who I was, not my old identity. And that just shifted so much in me. That partner in that container looking back and saying, I see who you are.
And I honor the courage it takes to be able to be real and trust. And that brings us back again to the title of what we're talking about, which is breaking free. And breaking free of those old stories, those old ways of being, and opening or trusting to the possibility that lies in front of us. And we're here to walk with you, alongside you, as that process happens. And as you can see, we're not just talking about it, but we're actually living it. And we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. Thanks, Jacques. And I'm just going to close with this too. Fear is part of life. We need it both for physical and emotional survival, but it has a time and a place. And we often find ourselves trapped in these patterns long after they serve us. And just like Jacqueline said there, breaking free and trusting involves identifying our fears and then moving through them. And in fact, this process of moving through our fears, it leads to all our growth and it leads to so much happiness. And our fears become these beautiful doorways we're meant to walk through and travel what I call the road of happy destiny. With that, we'll see you next time. You've been listening to me, Chris.
And me, Jacqueline, on Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living.
Tune in every second and fourth Monday at 3 p.m. on Transformation Talk Radio for more real conversations about life, death, and everything in between.
Learn to connect with your intrinsic power to grow and heal, how to laugh at your own humanness and not take life too seriously.
Through healthy conversations between the feminine and the masculine, you will learn how to harness the power of relationship and the mirror to befriend your shadow and to trust that any obstacle that gets in your way is there to help you grow.
For more information or to connect with us personally, visit theway-healing.com. That's theway-healing.com.